Hi and welcome to my video podcast. Today I'll be talking about the political crisis in Venezuela. This um, conversation that I hope to start is basically directed to my students of international politics. This video podcast is an assignment for my teaching with social media course. And I hope it can be as well a source of information for those who are interested in understanding the crisis in Venezuela. So I'll start by reflecting on the context of the crisis. I guess for those who have been following the situation in Venezuela for the past 5 to 7 years, this is not a surprise. It wasn't unexpected for many of us, but it has been a very unsettling circumstance, because knowing that the path taken not only by Chavez at the end of his life, but by Maduro once he was formally in power, it was predictable, and there were ways to avoid this human crisis. The problem is that we are trying to frame a political crisis as just the consequence of a bad political project. And I guess our duty, not only as Venezuelans, but also as teachers, researchers, those who consider themselves intellectuals, we have a duty to explain what it is, what it really is, and give some background with respect to what has happened and what the responsibilities in this tragedy are. And of course, at the end, I would like to reflect on the scenarios that many of us have spoken about. There is a crisis that has touched every single social group in the country. This was a political project that was raised, that was fed with, at least when it comes to rhetoric, it was thought to be an opportunity for those who had less, for those economically less successful, to have access, to have support, and to participate in what was the main attraction of an oil-producing economy, which is the distribution of those means, of those resources. I guess many understood that it was just social justice when Chavez said that there had to be a better way to use those resources, to distribute those resources, and that people needed to have not only a voice, but also a part of that wealth. And I guess this goes way back to who we are and where we come from, because it is one of the fantasies that in Venezuela many have thought to be reality. That we were a very rich country and that we were, in that same sense, we were very wealthy, which is not only factually misunderstanding, but also is a source of manipulation. We were not wealthy. We had natural resources that if we would have used in a different way, probably we wouldn't be looking at this terrible human tragedy. So the crisis is political, but it has an economic component. It has everything. It has mismanagement. It has corruption. It has crime. Because what we are looking at is a regime that has established very dangerous liaisons with not only corrupt individuals in military, in the civil side of the political party, but also with criminals. They have alliances with criminals. So this political project that came to power on the promise that it would give people participation, it would give people some sort of protagonism. It just shut the doors and kept power and its decisions in a very controlled environment. Of course, it was always within the frame of democracy, of institutions. Those were institutions created to be controlled by the regime, whether it was the communal councils or the clap, whatever it was intended to be a tool for control, for social control. So this is a very complex crisis because we might look at it as some sort of political crisis that evolved into an economic crisis. But at the center of it, and what really makes it more difficult to understand, is that it was always, there was always a way to connect it to the military. And what we are looking at now, is that there is no institutional way, there is no possibility in terms of what tools or instruments people have to make the Constitution, the law, prevail when it comes to the regime's decisions. Why? Because the military controlled those decisions. Chavez, before he died, he made sure that the military would have absolute control. And that explains why this crisis has been so difficult, not only to be understood, but to really be dealt with. We are looking at poverty for the past 4 years. It went from 24% to a 61%. There are numbers that say that it is right now close to a 90%. 87% was the last measure I read. Extreme poverty went up high between 2016 and 2017, it increased about 10%. We're talking about an oil-producing country with poverty and extreme poverty. This, of course, was, let's say, a domestic issue that was brought to light once the migration crisis exploded. We're talking about more than 3 million Venezuelans leaving the country between 2016 2017. Those numbers started to raise concern, and that number of 3 million is what basically has left the country these 2-3 years. And the expectation is that it will keep rising. There are several aspects of the crisis that transcend the political, the economical aspect. There is a social component of the crisis that's also part of the structural damage done to the country, because high crime rates, the highest in the region, maybe, I don't know if Honduras is on the top right now, but in the case of Venezuela, there is a high rate, and the most difficult part of explaining this is the connection between crime and social control. There is a very inefficient judiciary. The prison system doesn't work, so it's kind of it's a situation that conveniently the regime has used in its favor, because there have been several phases. Crime was used as a control tool, as a social control tool. Now it's food and medicines. The regime has always managed to use those critical issues in its favor. The economic part of the whole conversation is a little bit more easy to identify, because it relates to the oil economy. So, for example, when Venezuela was a country that used always to import certain goods, but it also had a certain industrial capacity. The government, when Chavez was alive, the government started a series of nationalization strategies in different areas, and it was basically taking control of the industrial activity in the country. Of course, that didn't really become some sort of power structure at all. It just ruined slowly the capacities the country had in certain areas. So you have to add what was already in the public domain with the newest, grocery stores, agricultural industry. It was just the state becoming bigger and bigger and more inefficient than it was already. So, of course, that had an impact when oil prices became a concern, because of the price started to decrease. And this had a social impact, because the less the government had in terms of revenue, oil revenue, the less capacity there was to import. and we're talking about food, medicines, uh, and many other, um, maybe not basic staples, but at least um, the most important ones were always depending on imports. This was, of course, a time bomb. When the moment came that government had to decide between, paying debt or just authorizing, because of the controls it had on foreign exchange also. So this was a complete crisis within the crisis, because it was absolutely a consequence of mismanagement, of poor decision making, and a completely failed uh, economic and political project that they have insisted on all along. So, of course, consumption uh, dropped. Um, there is the government rhetoric that says that this is all because of um, um, the United States sanctions in 2015. But if you take a look at this, at the timeline of the decisions, oil production had already started to drop, and imports already had started to drop before the first sanctions came in 2015. And by the way, those sanctions were personal sanctions. Those were not economic sanctions. So it's misguiding public opinion here in the U.S. and in Venezuela, because that economic war that the regime has insisted as a cause of, they were so inefficient and so incapable of even conducting what has been Venezuela's basic economic activity, which is oil production. They couldn't even keep up with that. So this scenario has created a complete human catastrophe, because what we're looking at is basically there's very little access to goods, basic goods. Of course, I'm not going to even mention what the monetary policy has been, but in all, what we are looking at is at a tragedy that was not only preventable. We have to look at it as something intentional, because how is it possible that the government, knowing what the policy has done to the country, they are still not only reinforcing it, they are defending that policy. So now, when finally the United States and all the countries align in the Lima group, have decided to increase pressure on the regime and the military, now we have a conflict, because there is a concern among progressive um, intellectual groups that this is nothing different than the United States trying to force regime change to take over Venezuela and its oil industry. I'm not sure that's the case here, because Venezuela has been selling oil to the United States, and basically all the revenue that Venezuela is receiving, or was until these sanctions, was from the United States. The other destination of oil was China, and it was not really cash what Venezuela was receiving in exchange, because it was basically paying debt, as well as Russia, and the giveaways to Cuba. So that's an argument that can be easily um, refuted. It's absurd to frame it that way. On the other side, we understand that there is a domestic issue that might be preventing people um, uh, in giving support to this initiative. We can understand it, but I think there is an important space for bipartisan support. We've seen it in Congress so far, that this crisis in Venezuela needs a permanent solution. And Venezuela's opposition has tried with conversations, with dialogue, with um, you know, trying to create a path to a political negotiation, but that has not been possible. That has not been the case. So I guess we should try to look at it as a move designed, because this has been carefully designed. It's what we see. This has been carefully designed to put pressure on Maduro and the military, because they are the ones who will finally, really, they are the deciders. They are the ones who can really put an end to the Venezuelan suffering. So this is not a strategy for regime change so the U.S. can keep Venezuela. I don't think we can really believe that that's the case. But what I do understand is that the United States and Colombia need a Venezuela in peace that right now is at risk to become not a failed state, to become a haven for criminals, for Colombian guerrilla, for drug traffickers, at the mercy of the people that remain there. So I understand that there is a domestic political issue that creates a very noisy environment. There is also an electoral interest that's legitimate. I won't argue that, but that's not the only reason. I think the most important reason is that for the sake of the region, for the safety of Latin America, the crisis in Venezuela needs to be resolved. And there is a need for a transition, peaceful transition. That's why I don't think the priority of the United States and Colombia is a military intervention. I seriously doubt it. I don't think that's what's that's not the first option they're looking at. But I believe that the economic sanctions could play a bigger role. But I do understand that it's important for the rest of Latin America to go along, play along with the United States when it comes to sanctions. I think it's important what the United States is doing with regards of the families of those who are considered to be important parts of the regime's coalition. I think it's important that other countries in Latin America follow, because we know that those aspects are more powerful than any other measure taken against them. So I understand the concerns many players have in this crisis, but I guess there's an important aspect of this that has to do with a more collective concern than just Venezuela as as a whole. So just to wrap it up, the way out, I think, is to put more pressure on the individuals, those who are involved in drug trafficking and corruption, and those are the ones that may want to listen to the possibility of a deal when it comes to their possible future indictments and that kind of discussion. Now, I understand that there is concern with respect to those who are suspect in human rights violations. I guess that's a different conversation, and that's what would need to be approached in a different way. But I guess the future is basically trying to move forward an option for transition through a negotiation. I don't think an election, a transparent election, could take place without taking these previous steps. Like, first, Maduro would have to leave office. There would have to be some sort of institutional rearrangement. Venezuela has no institutions. That's very important to sort out. And of course, after you have the removal of Maduro and you have the some institutional framework to work with, then you would think on the possibility of calling for elections. But right now, the transition would have to be, I guess, it would be some sort of body that would carry on this process according to the Constitution. And I only see this possible via a political negotiation. I'm not sure what the government expects a dialogue to be, because they understand that any conversation is just to set the exit way. How do you want to leave? Because it is clear to everybody that Maduro cannot remain in power. He is the main source of crisis in Venezuela. He is responsible for this human catastrophe. So the discussion about him being a candidate, I think this is not the moment to have that conversation. I guess we could have that conversation in the future, but right now, he has 14% of approval. So I don't think that's even, a logical conversation to have right now when we are just referring to his removal from office. So in the future, maybe, but right now, it's just for him to leave office, to have some transparency and some institutional rebuilding. That would be just electing a new electoral council and so on, and then we could talk about elections. So this is a very long first video podcast, and I hope I can start a new one soon. Thank you very much for watching this, and I'll see you then.